Shalom, good afternoon from Jerusalem, Israel. This is Mr. Lowell Joseph Gallen, founder of the Root and Branch Association Limited. Today is Monday, July 18th, 2022 in the Gregorian calendar, and the 19th day of the fourth Hebrew Israelite month of Tammuz in the Hebrew Israelite calendar, year 5782, the Shemitah sabbatical year. Welcome to episode number 9 of our monthly Root and Branch Association Lost Tribes Fellowship seminars, chaired by Fellowship Chairman Mr. Yair Davidiy, founder of Brit-Am and Hebrew Nations, one of the world's leading researchers, writers, and speakers on the issue of the lost tribes of Israel. We know each other many years, and it's a great privilege to host this series in our Root and Branch Association English Language Lecture and Conference Series. And now, without further ado, let me hand over the mic to our chairman, Mr. Davidiy. The subject of today's talk is the individual identity of the tribes. Yair, it's all yours.
Okay, shalom. I represent Brit-Am Hebrew Awareness. We research the whereabouts of the lost 10 tribes. We prove that the lost 10 tribes are amongst Western nations. Originally you had 12 tribes of Israel. As we keep repeating, there were 12 tribes of Israel, the 12 sons of Israel, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were the forefathers of the Israelite nation. Jacob was renamed Israel. And Israel, that is Jacob, begat 12 sons, and these became the 12 tribes of Israel. One of his sons, Joseph, had 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh, and these 2 sons became individual tribes in their own right, so that technically you would have had 13 tribes. But the Bible always maintains a quorum of 12, by either counting the 2 tribes of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh, as one tribe, the one tribe of Joseph, or of leaving out Levi, because Levi was divided amongst the other tribes. He was scattered amongst them. He didn't have his own consolidated territory. So he, for some purposes, was left out of the quorum, whereas the 2 tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh would have then been included, giving us a quorum, always maintaining a quorum of 12 tribes. On the whole, and this is what we have. We had 12 tribes, or we had 13 tribes, whatever the case. We had 3 tribes in the south. They divided. The 12 tribes of Israel divided into 2 different sections. There was a disagreement amongst the different tribes. There'd always been fiction amongst them, and eventually the 10 of the tribes in the north separated from the others, and they set up their own kingdom. Whereas in the south there remained the tribes of Judah, Benjamin, and after that most of Levi, and minority representatives of all the other tribes, and this was the kingdom of Judah. And the present-day Jews derive from the kingdom of Judah. Whereas the northern tribes were separated, they remained separated, they worshipped idols, they went in the ways of the kingdom of the peoples around them. Because of that they were punished, as is explained in detail in 2 Kings chapter 17. And they worship idols, became like the pagans, and so they were punished. They were taken away by the Assyrians. There's different sections of the Assyrian Empire, and in those areas they re-established themselves. They remained together physically or to some degree, and eventually managed to assert their independence and to move out of the Assyrian region, or to have been taken away by Assyrians who were recolonizing areas to the west of them. Whatever the reason, whatever the means, different sections of the Israelite tribes all began to move away. They moved to the north and they moved to the west, and eventually consolidated themselves, converged in western areas, areas of Western Europe. And there we find them. We can trace them. We can trace these peoples historically. We can trace them from the maps of Ptolemy. The geography is ancient. The geography of Ptolemy. Ptolemy was a Roman. In Roman times, he actually wrote in Greek. He lived in Egypt. He wrote in Greek, but he was a part of the Roman Empire. He can be considered a Roman, but he used sources that were previous to him. He used Phoenician sources that were 200 or 300 years before his time. So he was quite detailed. He gave us quite detailed accounts of the world in his time, and a lot of these details that he gives have been confirmed by historical researchers. So that's one of the sources we use that help us trace the tribes of Israel to different areas. We use other sources. We use Greek and Roman sources. We use legends. We use traditions. We use Talmudic sources and related sources. Anything that has anything to say on the subject, we use it. And we're able to trace the migrations of these 12 tribes of Israel to different areas and moving from one place to another. We even are able to trace them as they move from here to there. And the Asian historians themselves also registered these movements, spoke of them, and they had traditions about them. And even though when they were exiled, they had been exiled for going the ways of the nations around them. They adopted many of the customs and habits of the peoples around them. And after they were exiled, this increases was intensified, but here and there retained different aspects of their previous Hebrew heritage. Find linguistic traces, we find customs, legends, we find all kinds of what we could say signs of their whereabouts and of their movements. And one of the most impressive sources that we found is the movement according to names. They often retain their tribal names. Now, when the Israelites, when the land of Israel, we find in the book of Genesis, chapter 46, it registers 70 souls who went down to Egypt. With Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. In the time of Jacob, Jacob was renamed Israel. Israel had 12 sons. And one of his sons was Joseph. Joseph went down into Egypt, and then he caused the rest of the family to come with him. And then in Genesis 46, it mentions how the extended family of Jacob, that is Jacob, his 12 sons, and the sons of the sons, and in some cases even the sons of the sons, all of them moved down to Egypt at the behest of Joseph, who was already there. They moved down to Egypt to settle, and the names of those who were moving down, 70 names, 7 out of 70 sons and grandsons are mentioned. And these sons and grandsons were organized. They were organized in tribes, 12 tribes, and amongst the tribes you had tribal clans. And so these names are repeated with some minor changes in Numbers, book of Numbers in the Bible, in chapter 26. And so we have it. We have these names and we trace these names. And we find them in different areas. So one of the areas we find them in is the British Isles. Okay. Amongst the settlers of the British Isles, we had the Angles. First, you had the Celts in conventional terms. First of all, the British Isles were settled by Celtic people. Celtic-speaking people. And these Celtic-speaking people, they did not call themselves Celts. Celt is a new name or a name borrowed from Roman records, but it wasn't the name they actually applied to themselves. The name they used for themselves appears to have been Hiberi or Iberi, and even now the name Hibernian, applied to an Irishman, comes from that source. And we have the maps of Ptolemy mention the Iberi and Iberni in the British Isles. And we have numerous place names throughout the British Isles, also in Western France, also in other areas of so-called Celtic settlement. And this appears to be the ethnic ethnonym, the ethnic name that they applied to themselves, Heberi, which actually is another way of pronouncing the word Hebrew. In the Hebrew language, Hebrew is Ivri. Ivri could easily have become Ibri or Iberi because the V and the B sounds in Hebrew interchange with each other. And we find amongst this name, Heberi, for the same changes in the pronunciation of the name as existed in the Hebrew language. So this in itself is a sign that they call themselves Hebrew. The name Hebrew in the Bible is especially associated with Joseph. Joseph is referred to as a Hebrew boy in the Egyptian speech. And so these were the Celts. After the Celts came the Angles and the Saxons, who conquered what is now known as England. The Angles were also known as Agli. On the continent, another name for Angles was Agli. Agli in Hebrew, as we find in Jeremiah 31, is another name for Ephraim. It's a nickname for Ephraim. In Hebrew, Agli means bull calf. And so too, the bull was associated with Joseph, and the bull, and even today, the English are known as John Bull. It's a name associated with the English. So we have this association. Another association we have concerns Machir. Machir is found in Maringis, or different names given to us, an important set of Mercians. There is that is a form of the name Machir, metathesis of the name Machir, and this was applied to an important section of the Saxons. And we relate them to Machir, the son of Manasseh. And we find that the so-called English peoples, contained elements both from Manasseh and from Ephraim. We have tribal names such as Parasi. Paris was a section of Manasseh in the north of England, and other names. And these names, we find them dominant in the north of England, in Scotland, in Ireland, in the west of England. And from that area came, after the British or the English began to colonize the New World, and they set up the 13 colonies of America, that 80% of the early colonists came from areas that we may associate with Manasseh, with tribes associated with Manasseh. And not only that, we also find that sociologically they were different, somewhat different. The ones who went to England were somewhat different from those who stayed behind, from a sociological historical perspective. And we find a similar phenomenon much later in the 1870s and 1880s, and the migrations, millions of Germans, of people from Germany went to North America. And we find differences in those who went to America and those who stayed behind. And there have been studies done on this. It's not something that we invented or that we found or that we discovered. We are building on what other academics have spent years, decades, researching and writing papers on, and publishing it. It is well known, at least in academic circles, or in all, is also relatively easily accessible. And once it was taken as commonplace knowledge, Ripley, even in his account, which was once a classical account of the races of Europe, he mentions it, that there were different, that even the migrants to the USA were different physically. Those who went to Germany from those who stayed behind, so that there were differences were noticed. And also the relative degrees of anti-Semitism. The Germans who went to America were much less anti-Semitic than the Native Americans whom they settled amongst, and much less anti-Semitic than the Germans who stayed behind. So there were differences. So there are differences. People separate. People divide. There's a lady, a genealogist in the Northern Ireland, has done a lot of work on this, showing how migrants separate out, people stay together, and so on. At all events, there are grounds to show that the people who went to the USA were somewhat different from the Europeans who stayed behind. You can take it or leave it, but there is something to substantiate such a claim. And we identified the USA with Manasseh. And who was the son of Manasseh? Who was the son of Manasseh? Machir, the firstborn son of Manasseh. And Machir gave his name to America. America is named after Machir. How? So how is Machir? How is America named after Machir, the son of Manasseh? So here we go back in history. There was in the beginning from the 700 CE up until 900 CE, there was a dynasty in the southeast of France that was headed by a Jew, or the originator of this dynasty was a Jew. At first he was a religious Jew, later his descendants converted to Christianity, and they were assimilated amongst the aristocracy of that region, or the aristocracy of Western Europe in general. And he was the founder of this dynasty. It has been proven by Zuckerman in a very thorough research, work by Zuckerman. He did extremely thorough research on the subject. He showed from Hebrew documents, Jewish documents, from non-Jewish documents, that the founder of this dynasty had in fact been a religious Jew who had befriended Charles Martel, the father of Charlemagne, and afterwards Charlemagne after him. They were the rulers of France at that time. And his name in Hebrew was Machir. His name in Hebrew was Machir. Also in Hebrew, it was referred to as Ha-Machiri. Now, Ha-Machiri in the Bible, if you look it up in the Bible, if you know Hebrew, or even if you don't just ask anyone, in the Bible, it's Ha-Machiri, literally, in the text means the sons of Machir, Ha-Machiri. Like Ha means the, Machiri is the plural, Ha-Machiri. That was literally, that's what it means. But in the medieval times, different Jewish sages, different Jewish scribes and so on would give nicknames to each other. So someone called Machir was referred to as Ha-Machiri. Literally it meant the sons of Machir, but they took it to, as we would use it, Machiri, the little Machir. Machir, Ha-Machiri was a nickname given to this founder of the dynasty, Machir, Ha-Machiri. And he was quite a hero. He was a local hero. He used to go out to war. He used to join the forces of Charlemagne and of his father before him. And he was well known. And actually the local Gentiles made him a saint. Zuckerman has shown that in some of the Gentile ballads, local ballads, he's described as a Jew, and others he's described as a Christian saint, a Christian holy man. At all events, historically, he was Jewish. He remained Jewish, even though the Christians tried to convert him after his death and make him into one of the holy ones. And he was well known. And his name, Ha-Machiri, it was also written about in Latin. But the word Ha-Machiri doesn't transliterate very well into Latin. You can't do it. It uses Hebrew syllables that do not have exact parallels in European languages. So they changed the name somewhat. They Latinized it to America or Americo. And the name became popular in that area. And eventually, Americo Vespucci, who was born in Italy, but not that far away. He was born in the northwest of France, of Italy, whereas the original Machir was in the southeast of France. They border each other, and the name was also popular in both areas. So Americo Vespucci received this name. And Americo Vespucci, after Christopher Columbus, he was a famous navigator. But they weren't certain after Christopher Columbus discovered America, and they even began to settle America and settle the West Indies. They weren't certain if America was part of Asia, an eastern portion of Asia, or if it was a separate continent. Well, America Vespucci helped prove that there was a separate continent, a continent in its own right. And he went around the coast and he drew maps of it and so on. And whether by mistake or by intention is not certain. One way or other, the whole of America was named after him. And you can see from this that America was actually named after the son of Manasseh, after Machir. And America, the source of the name America actually means Ha-Machir, meaning the sons and descendants of Machir. So we have America being named after Machir. So you can say that, and that to our mind is a proof of divine providence. It's very important, but not everyone is enthusiastic about this approach, but it's a possibility. Another point is that we trace a good portion of the early settlers from Britain to back to areas in Britain that otherwise we identify with the descendants of Manasseh, mainly through tribal names that are similar to those of descendants of Manasseh, and also the very name Manasseh, according to Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, who was a great commentator in the 1800s, is well known. He's in Germany. He wrote a very comprehensive commentary on the Bible, and he was well known. He is an important Jew, and he's very important in Jewish history. And he explained the name Manasseh to in effect mean a representation, a responsible representation. And he gives a linguistic analysis of the name Manasseh. And he says in effect the name Manasseh means responsible representation. And he gives a few examples. One of the examples perhaps is the example to follow. We haven't got that much time, so I won't go into detail of it. But one of his examples is the word noshe. Noshe in Hebrew means loan, borrower, or someone who loans money. And someone who loans money, he gives money to someone else, but he still remains attached to it. He still has a claim on it. So too, Manasseh, the name Manasseh is someone who does something, but he is responsible to someone else. And the other words with the same root noshe, which give it the same meaning, the same connotation. So in effect, the name Manasseh means responsible representation. And that is what gave rise to the USA. No taxation without representation. That was the slogan when they rebelled against the British, against the English, 1776. And the American Constitution that embodies that principle is something very important to Americans. Other people don't really care what the Constitution says. You ask someone from France, someone from Australia, someone from almost anywhere in the world, what does it say in the American Constitution, in their Constitution? What does their Constitution mean to them? What principles are embodied in it? And I won't be able to tell you. You ask an American what his Constitution means, if he knows, he'll tell you, and he'll attach as much importance to it as if it was part of the 10 Commandments, it's something of his very essence. Remember Richard Nixon, how they did impeach Richard Nixon. Why did they impeach Richard Nixon? What did he do that was so terrible? He broke a rule of the American Constitution. Other presidents can do all kinds of things and get away with them, but someone who transgresses a principle of the American Constitution, they just can't do it. It's a no-no with them. It's part of their internal national characters. This principle of responsible representation embodied in the Constitution. So this too, in its own ways, a proof that Manasseh would dominate in the USA, and the USA together with Canada, together with other British-speaking descended nations, together with the UK, they have been very important in founding Western civilization and in carrying on the task that was given to them, was given to Joseph primarily to civilize the world and to uplift the world. It was given to all of the 10 tribes, but the primary one who was primarily responsible for it was Joseph. And that is what they have done, and they do this historically. So that's one thing. We also have other names of different tribes that we can trace, through which we can trace Israelite tribes. Reuben, we find Reuben amongst the French. We have the Ribuari Franks who have found the country of France as we know it. We also have different names. Palu, one of the sons of Reuben, is known as Falia. Some of the Franks who invaded France, who settled France. Hezroni Davons, or the Sicambri Franks, and others. We also have the fact that France is in the area known in the Bible as Zarephath. Zarephath in Hebrew means France. Rashi, one of the foremost commentators in the Bible, in the book of Obadiah 1:18, he says that France is the area known today as known in our time as France. Zarephath is known as a word known as France, and this was the place where the lost 10 tribes came to. That's what he says expressly. And he identifies that area with that of the lost 10 tribes. And if Rashi says something in Jewish tradition, doesn't mean it has to be automatically accepted, but has to be related to with the full respect, with the great respect, because Rashi was possibly the foremost commentator on biblical and on religious matters in general in Jewish history. So we're not talking about someone that we plucked out of the blue. We found the most respectable commentator in existence, confirming an aspect of our findings. And so that concerning Reuben, concerning Gad, Gad is very good because Gad fits in very well. Gad is also known as, or has a name, Gad, which in Hebrew, in ancient Hebrew, it could have been pronounced as Goth. I found this. Where did I find this? I found this in a book written by a Temanite Jew in Israel. He wrote a small little booklet saying what, in his opinion, was the correct way to pronounce Hebrew words, Hebrew letters. And he wasn't care about the lost tribes. He didn't know anything about Brit-Am. What he was trying to establish was that the Temanite, the Jewish Temanite pronunciation of Hebrew letters was the most correct one according to the Bible. And according to the Bible, the name that we pronounce as Gad should be pronounced, or could alternately be pronounced more often than not, as Goth. In other words, Goth is a legitimate alternate for the name Gad, Goth. And also we find the name Gad in place names associated with the Goths. So the Goths use both forms, both Gad and Goth, for themselves, to apply to themselves. And the Goths, they are known for a group of them who wandered around Europe, wandered here, wandered there, eventually got to southern France, and also into Spain and so on. But they are not necessarily, that group is important, it has importance, though some researchers claim that by the time they ended up where they ended up, the ethnic constitution had already changed because they took in other people, conquered people, and amalgamated with different tribes, and so they changed their ethnic constitution, changed as they moved. Be that as it may, the Goths also had another section in Sweden. The Goths and the Svea together gave rise to the kingdom of Sweden. So we find, on this alone, we find Gad in the kingdom of Sweden. We also find different clans of Gad in Sweden and in Scandinavia in general. We find Hagi, who is part of the Franks and the Chalky, also in the north in that area. We find Shuni, also pronounceable as Suoni, and the Svea, also known as Suioni, which is in Hebrew an acceptable pronunciation for Shuni, the son of Gad, northern Hebrew. We also find Esbon, we find Osni, and we find Arodi, and in the Scandinavia we have the people Harudi, which is the same as Arodi in Hebrew. Harudi is almost the same. Areli or Areli, the son of Gad, the Eruli in Sweden and Scandinavia, the same, almost the same name. and so on. And we also find aspects of the characteristic of Gad in amongst the Swedes. Gad, I looked up on the Hebrew, different rabbinical commentators, the characteristics of Gad, and they analyze his name. They said Gad, the name Gad comes from the word Gedud. Gedud means chop up. It also means small sections. And to break everything up into small sections. And it said that the Gad has a quality of linking up, of working together. A small groups of people working together. And so I looked it up on the internet. The national characteristics of the Swedish people according to Swedes themselves. And one of the prominent features that they mentioned is that the Swedes don't like leaders. They don't like leaders. They prefer to sit around and to discuss things and to let decisions somehow or other emanate from the group as a whole. That's the way they work things. And for them, it works. They are, relatively speaking, successful and always have been. I'm not saying it's a good, it's applicable for other people, but works for them. It's suited to the national characteristics. And this was one of the national tribal characteristics of Gad, according to rabbinical commentators. So here we have a one-on-one association, which of interest we have, and now I'm cherry picking different things, obviously. But if I wanted to, or if we had time, I could go through each and every one and bring out hundreds of examples like this. Some of them just as strong, some of them are stronger, some of them a little bit weaker, but they all point in the same direction. For all of the tribes, or nearly all of the tribes, we have very close approximations from all different sources concerning the identification of these Israelite tribes. We have more, obviously. We have more. We also have different Hebrew, Jewish, and pagan or semi-pagan legends that indicate that the lost in tribes in the Second Temple period were considered to be in the British Isles or in the areas around them. This is also important. People don't know this, but it exists. Documentation exists for it. And it's there. We had the Issachar. Issachar, we find Issachar both amongst the Finns and amongst the Swiss. We use something somewhat piquant parallel you can find for the equation of the Finns with Issachar. The national animal of Finland is a brown bear, and in Finnish culture it's quite important. It's not just something that is there, it's something they attach importance to, the brown bear. And in Yiddish culture names, when you have tribal names, bear is associated with Issachar bear. Someone named Issachar in Yiddish will more often not also be referred to Issachar bear. The bear is associated with Issachar in Yiddish Jewish culture. And we find Issachar associated with the Finns, with the Finnish people. We also find amongst the Finnish people traditions of Jewish ancestry. Just today, someone on the phone told me about different things. He said it's well known, portions of Finland. Said some people are somewhat afraid for different reasons to talk about it. But amongst certain circles, it's well known that at least a portion of the people from Finland descend from Israelite tribes. And he sounded genuine. And I've heard this from others as well, or similar things along similar lines. So the Issachar, a lot of people in Finland believe that they descend from the 10 tribes of Israel. And they have certain parallels, certain customs, especially marriage customs, certain names, certain different aspects of their culture, which also seem to affirm this. We have the tribe of Zebulun. Zebulun we identify with the Netherlands. Zebulun was given the blessing, the Chof Yamim Yishkon, that he would dwell on the shores of the sea. The people of the Netherlands do dwell on the shores of the sea. They dwell on the seashores. Holland, about one half of the land of Holland is reclaimed sea land. It should be under the sea. It was lands that was either taken right back from the sea or lands that was periodically flooded by the sea. They put up dikes and walls and pumps and all kinds of protective devices and mounds, and they push the sea back. And more than half the population, or much more actually, of the population dwell on areas reclaimed from the sea. And all over Holland, the subsoil, you dig down, you want to build a house or dig a hole in Holland, wherever you go in the Netherlands, almost anywhere you go in the Netherlands, all the subsoil is sand, sea sand. The Dutch literally dwell on the shores of the sea. The subsoil of their houses is sea sand, and they dwell on the shores of the sea, but they have pushed right back. And we even find in the map of Ptolemy people who dwelt a little bit to the north of present-day Holland, because at that time what is now known as Holland was uninhabitable. But people came from the south of Scandinavia, the south of Scandinavia, moved into the Netherlands. And one of those people mentioned up there is known as Sabalingoi. And they did not have the Z. They lost the use of the Z sound. So instead of Zebulon, they used Sabalin. And Goy in Hebrew means people. Literally, these people mentioned there are known as Sabalin Goy. And it says that Zebulon would dwell on the shores of the sea, and its border would be to Zidon. And we found settlements with names similar to Zidon in Western Germany, close to the border with present-day Holland. In other words, they reached up to that area. So this too is important. And we also use the maps of Ptolemy. We used other sources. So in this case, we have a one-on-one identification. We also have it for other reasons. And everything comes together, a little bit here, a little bit there, and it all creates a composite picture, parts of a jigsaw that all fit in, and nothing else will fit in there. And this is proof. And this is what we have in each and every case. We not only do have it in each and every case, but all the different parts link up with each other. The different tribes, we find the different tribes in the same areas as they held, the same areas relative to each other as existed when they traveled to the desert, in the wilderness, before they entered the land of Israel, and afterwards when they settled in the land of Israel. They had the same relative tribal formations compared relative to one another as they now have now. We also have legends amongst the Frisians, amongst a portion of the Dutch that expressly say that they descend from Israel. They, together with the Angles and Saxons. And these legends date back to the 1600s, 1500s, so they're not that old, but they exist. Someone had this idea, someone received this type of tradition, and we find these types of traditions throughout the areas that we are concerned with. So there's something there. We also have the tribe of Dan. The tribe of Dan was an important tribe in ancient Israel. We have done quite a bit of research on the tribe of Dan. And some of our research was in a de facto sense adopted by academics. It was discussed on academic forums. It is more or less accepted as a possibility. And we found Dan in different areas. We found Dan not only in the areas mentioned in the Bible, especially in the Bible, but we found Dan in southeast Turkey. We found him in Cyprus. We found him elsewhere. And others also found him there. And Dan got around. Dan was an important tribe. Dan eventually became the Danes of Denmark. Also became sections, different portion of the people of Ireland, portion of the different parts of the British Isles, southwest England, So too, there too, we find the settlements of people named after Dan. And Dan has his, the name Dan is found. Denmark means the mark of Dan. And wherever Dan moved, he left his name behind, as he was in the Bible. In the Bible, we find wherever Dan went, where it says when they moved when they were moving to the north, a group of Danites were moving out from the south, from the area that they held around the portion of Jaffa, Tel Aviv, that region. It was too straight for them. It was difficult for them to move there, so they were moving to the northern Galilee. And on the way, they camped in an area. And it says, therefore, the area is named the camp of Dan, Mahane Dan. Even today, it's called still named after Mahane Dan, that area. The camp of Dan. Dan left his name wherever he went. And Dan was compared to a snake by Jacob, their forefather. Jacob said that Dan is a snake in the path. And a snake, when we have snakes, you look, we have a dusty trail. You see where the snake has gone slithering through the dust. They leave their marks on the way. So too, Dan left his marks on the way he went to, and not only that does he show the pathway he went into, he also shows, incidentally, the pathway that others of the 10 tribes also went alongside him, before him, after him, and behind him, whatever. They were all part of the one movement of peoples. So this is important. It is significant. We have a similar concerning Naftali also. We find Naftali. We find Naftali, something we came across just recently that may or may not be of importance, but we thought it was interesting. Naftali in Hebrew is associated with struggle, with wrestling, with one portion intertwining with another. But in modern Hebrew, Neft, the major portion of that name, Naftali, Neft, means oil. And the present mainstay of country of Norway is petroleum, is oil. They have more oil resources, or known exploitable oil resources, than any other country in Europe. And they are quite rich because of it. It's what they live off in effect, more or less. They also have an industry, they have other things going for them. But oil is the main thing. It's a godsend, one could say. If it was not for that, they would have trouble getting by. Now they get by quite nicely. So this is found in the name Naftali, and we identify the people in Norway with the tribe of Naftali for other reasons. Incidentally, we came across this other point of interest. This is what we have. We also have island. Island, we identify island as primarily people who settled in Ireland, also in Scotland, also in Scandinavia, but mainly in Ireland. And Asher, the name Asher in Hebrew, means happiness. And the Irish are known for being a happy people. A friend of mine from France, he traveled in Ireland, and he said every winter he was surprised that the Irish people seem to be always smiling, always happy. Also, there's a song about it. When Irish eyes are smiling, or the world is smiling too. Yeah, it's a known song. I can't sing, otherwise I'd give you a rendition. But you have to hear it elsewhere, but it's quite a nice song. And it shows something about the Irish character. And the Asher was incidentally known as to be a warrior, and Irish are warriors. There's a strong hint that the Irish would be formidable warriors, and the Irish are warriors. One third of the imperial troops of the British Empire were from Ireland. So they talk about being anti-imperialist and so on. And denigrating the Irish, denigrating the Irish and denigrating the British because of the imperialist past of the British. But it was thanks to the Irish that the British Empire was able to hold itself together. Not only in the common soldier level, but also great people. Great British military leaders also emerged from Ireland and others. So this is an aspect of the Irish character that they may not like to own up to, but they have it. Also now, the world boxing champion, Tyson Fury, the first white man for a few generations. He's a world heavyweight boxing champion. He's of Irish and he's also a British citizen, and he's proud of both. So we have this aspect. We have this aspect of Ireland, of Irishmen. And we also have names and we have legends in Irish literature that indicate that they came from Israel, that they in the past were ancient Israelites. They themselves, they have a tradition that their ancestors kept the laws of Moses. They don't say, they don't say especially that they were Jewish, that they were Israelites, but they strongly indicate it in several places as if they are afraid to come out right out and say it, but they talk around about it. So the implications, the logical deduction would be that they are descended from Israel. Issachar both in Finland and in Switzerland. And one of the characteristics or one phrase concerning Issachar said Issachar had men of judgments who would give Israel knowledge of the times. That was one of the characteristics of Issachar. Literally it meant, according to tradition, it meant that Issachar produced mathematicians, people who were mathematically inclined, were able to make complicated astronomical computations and to tell the rest of the Israelites what the day was, what the time was, how the Hebrew calendar would work itself out in practice, which was important for agricultural reasons, for all kinds of reasons to know this in advance. Nowadays, we use a Hebrew calendar that was computed, which was laid out in advance. It's relatively accurate, but it's not entirely so, but it's what we use because the sages gave their authority for it in this time and age. And we don't need it to be as accurate as it had to be in the time when a lot of public decisions concerning the future yields of crops and so on had to be known. But in those times, this was important information. So this is what the blessing was, that Issachar would have knowledge of the times to tell Israel what to do. And so the Swiss continue to do the same. They give us watches. They tell us the time, tell us what to do and when to do it. So that is nice. But have a lot of things like this. It's interesting. We also have different blessings concerning what these nations would have, what they would be like. We have this the fact that Ephraim, Joseph was likened to a bull. So too in England you have John Bull. Joseph had a picture on his standard. Joseph, in effect, you had Midrash gives each tribe had its own standard and its own symbol. So Joseph actually had three symbols. There was a symbol for both, for all of Joseph together, that is Ephraim and Manasseh together. And the symbol of Joseph was the picture of Egypt. And the symbol for Ephraim was a bull, and the symbol of Manasseh was what is known as Ephraim, which according to different sources that we accept, that we believe are accurate, was actually a picture of a unicorn. The symbol of Joseph was a picture of Egypt. And where do we find what nation is symbolized by a picture of Egypt? So what is America, USA symbolized by? The dollar. One of the most important symbols of the USA, is a dollar bill. And on the dollar bill, you have a picture of the Great Seal. And what does the Great Seal show you? It shows you a pyramid. And when you look at a pyramid, what do you think of? You think of Egypt. And this pyramid has above it an eye, an all-seeing eye representing the eye of providence. And this is hinted at in the blessing to Joseph. The eye would be above him. It says in the blessing to Joseph. The eye above. This is what we have, the eye above. So there are some people, conspiracy theory people and so on, said the whole thing of the Great Seal is derived from Masonic symbolism. So first of all, we doubt that. But it could be, even if it was. So what? Somehow or other, the members of the founding fathers, they all belonged to Masonic lodges. It was a manly thing to do in those times. It was like men have clubs, men have associations, men like playing with games, having secret symbols and making connections one with each other for business purposes. That is what people do all over the earth. And this is a male thing. So maybe they did belong to Masonic lodges. But it's not necessarily entirely Masonic, because we also find these symbols used in other connotations, in other groups, and it wasn't necessarily entirely Masonic. And even if it was, it doesn't really matter. The fact is that it was used, and this symbol as what helps us identify the USA as part of Joseph. So that is what we have. We also have the blessing of Balaam, the pagan priest. It was when the Israelites were approaching the land of Israel, they were coming into the land of Israel, and they were passing by the borders of Moab and Ammon. The king of Moab was afraid that the Israelites would come and they would encroach upon his territory, eat up all the areas surrounding. So he called, after consulting with his allies, the princes of Midian, and they called to Balaam, who was a high priest on a place named as Bethbor on the Euphrates River, a high priest, some type of pagan high priest who also believed in the God of Israel, believed in God Almighty, even though he was more into the sorcery aspects of it. And he called upon him to come and curse Israel. And this person came, and every time he tried to curse Israel, only blessings came out. So from his blessings, we can learn what he intended, how he intended to, what his curses were intended to be. And his blessings also help us identify the lost 10 tribes of Israel, because amongst other things, he mentions the lion and the unicorn, that Israel in the end times would be a powerful nation, represented by the lion and the unicorn. The lion and the unicorn are the symbols of Great Britain. And Great Britain was the foremost power of Israelite tribes up until fairly recently. Now it's eclipsed somewhat by the USA, or eclipsed a great deal by the USA, but it's still a player in the game, and it might still come back to being something close to what it once was, or it might not. We'll wait and see. At all events, it played a very strong historical role. It helped establish the state of Israel. It helped set the background, the infrastructure, and everything that was necessary for the state of Israel to be built upon. It's thanks to the British, even though here and there some of them reneged on the idea, weren't so enthusiastic towards it at certain crucial moments. Even so, the initial push, the initial developments, right up until the end, came from the British. And even in the UN, even when the vote in the UN to recognize the state of Israel, Britain abstained because it couldn't very well vote for either side, because it was a party to the issue, a go-between between the Arabs and the Jews. But Britain did encourage those who were attached to her, its former colonies and so on, to vote on behalf of recognizing the state of Israel. It's something that people are not many people are aware of. And the British themselves don't mention it for obvious reasons, but it did happen. And this is what we have. We have Ephraim known as Egel, known as Bukar, In Hebrew, it means Buka. This was a name for Ephraim. And also Rashi says that Egel is a nickname for Ephraim. Egel meaning Buka. And Egel is another way of pronouncing the word angle. In Europe, when they invaded from the areas of the Netherlands and from Western Germany, they were known as Angle and as Egel in those areas, fulfilling the blessings given to the Israelites, that they would be at the ends of the earth, that they would be in islands, that there would be a Brit-Am, a confederation of peoples. The word Brit-Am is used for the lost in tribes in see Isaiah 42 and Isaiah 49, where you find this word twice used in association with the lost in tribes of Israel. And Britain itself was sometimes, the name Britain was sometimes written, like 200 or 300 years ago, was sometimes written as Brit-Amia. It was another way of saying or writing the name Britain. And this is the very name used in Isaiah in the Hebrew Bible. Another point of interest that just yesterday, someone called John Hemingway, a linguist, he sent me a note. In our book, The Tribes, this is our book, The Hebrew Tribes, this is the latest edition of our book, Hebrew Tribes, we identify the tribe of Asher with people who settled in Ireland, and also with the people known as the Vandals in medieval European history. Now, the Vandals are an interesting people. The Vandals first appear in association with the Goths. The Goths came from Sweden, and also they settled on what is now Poland, the northern shores of Poland, and also in what became Prussia. The Goths settled in those areas, and they were associated with the Vandals. The Vandals were allied to them, and they were similar to them in culture. And the Vandals are said to have absorbed, were actually similar to the Goths, had a Germanic speaking type culture, but they absorbed or were closely associated with others in that region, which is believed to have a Celtic culture, and they absorbed different tribes. They absorbed a tribe that had names of four different tribes, very similar to the sons of Ashur. And so we identify these people with Ashur. And we trace them, and we find the Vandals. First, so as we said, that we're in the areas of what is now Poland. They move out, they attack the Roman Empire, they moved here, they moved there. They moved into France, and after France, they moved into Spain. And from Spain, they moved into North Africa. And shortly afterwards, they disappeared. And that's what is known. And in this book, The Tribes, we trace them, we associated them with groups that appeared in Ireland, and from Ireland moved into the British Isles. And these people from Ireland were known as Africans. We said they were Africans because they were the Vandals who had moved from North Africa to Ireland, and there was an lane of intercommunication, of mutual trade, of peoples crossing over back to and forth between Ireland and North Africa. And that's what we said. So John Hemingway has since gone back over this, and he has brought up linguistic proofs confirming it. I also brought up, he shows from also the records of the time that even though the Vandals were in North Africa, they didn't intermix with the local population, or they intermixed very little, and they disappeared. And they had they moved to Ireland, and he shows through linguistic traces how you can trace them. And one of the points he mentions is that the archaeologists, or actually DNA, people who work with DNA, have shown that 1% of the people of Ireland and of Scotland come from the Berbers. In other words, it was some link to Northern Africa. Also, the cloaks in the highlands, the tartan cloaks that they used to wrap themselves up, are identical to the same cloaks that were used in North Africa. So there was a connection to North Africa. And there was a legend that some of them had come from Africa, and from there a portion of them moved to England, invaded England together at the same time as the Anglo-Saxons did. When the Anglo-Saxons came in from the east, other peoples from Ireland were moving into the west, moving into what is now Wales, into Western England, the western coast of England, and into what is Scotland. And they can be associated with the tribe of Machir. And this is, as if to say, confirmed from different sources. So anyway, I covered most of it. A good portion of on one leg, you could say, of what should be known. Some of the most important.
We want to thank, as so often, Steve of California.
Yeah, here's
joining
Steve of
us
California
today. And Steve is one of the world leaders now in the movements to reunify the 12 tribes of Israel. I think that's a modest but accurate, I mean, it's understated, but accurate description.
Okay.
And it's a privilege to live in such times.
Yair and Lowell, the important thing we need to remember in all these presentations that Yair is giving us, that the time, speaking of time, the time that these revelations, which is what they are, revelations for the understanding of what's in the Torah about the 10 tribes, will be given out to the public. The purpose of that is to regather in the latter days, the 10 tribes, and that has begun. And we will, in the future, by the Almighty's direction, be given the power to do that. And this is the beginning of the outgoing of that power to the leadership of those who will be awakened early from among the 10 tribes to do this very, very important task. So may I just say that Yaakov said that in Genesis 49:2, he was talking to him about what will happen to the sons, his 12 sons, in the latter days, when the latter days will come upon them.